Thank you for that warm welcome, Frankston. My name's Robyn Annear. I'm here at the invitation of the Wheeler Centre, who's behind tonight's event. And with me, of course, is Tom Keneally, who I know you're all here to see. Tom needs no introduction, but Tom, I'm going to give you one anyway. Tom's the author of books so numerous that if I were to name them all, there'd be no time left for him to speak, so I won't name them all. Among his novels, though, are 2 winners of the Miles Franklin Award, 2 shortlisted for the Booker, and a winner of the Booker, of course, Schindler's Ark from 1982, later filmed as Schindler's List. And Tom, that made Tom the first Australian to win the Booker, and there have been notable additions to that list since. Then there's his non-fiction, of course, including The Great Shame, Commonwealth of Thieves, and his latest grand undertaking, Australians, of which this is Volume 3, and our excuse for being here tonight. Tom's known, of course, not just as a writer, but as an advocate for an Australian Republic, for refugees and asylum seekers, and for writers, both as a mentor and through his involvement in the Australian chapter of PEN, the International Organisation for Writers. And besides all that, he's officially a national living treasure. Is that a burden or a blessing? This year, 2014, marks 50 years since the publication of Tom's first novel, The Place at Witton. 50 years in the business. And true to form, he's published not 1 but 2 books this year, a novel, Shame and the Captives, based on the Cowra breakout story, and the 3rd volume of Australians, this one, Flappers to Vietnam, which charts the period from the 1920s through till the 60s, in fact through till the disappearance of Harold Holt. And I do hope that while you're here in Melbourne, you'll take advantage of the Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Pool and take a dip. Just watch out for those midget subs while you're there. It's an honour to have Tom Keneally's company here this evening. Join me in welcoming him, Tom Keneally.
Thank you very much.
Now, Tom, you started off those 50 years ago as a novelist, but now about a third of the books listed in the front of your latest are non-fiction. It's an extensive list, and that means a lot of non-fiction has been written as well as the fiction. And even your novels, like your latest one, are often historical or based on real events. So where did it originate? Who knows where it'll eventuate? Where did it originate, this passion of yours for research and for writing that's grounded in fact? How far back?
If I could answer how it arose, I'd have a better understanding of myself. I think it's the idea that the experience that we all have when you read a book that's a bit revelatory to you, you think, I never knew that happened. I never knew these figures were like that. Occasionally, you have the experience of understanding a new dimension of the present or the past through having a writer reveal a different salient aspect of people. And I've always liked that when it happens. I've always liked that sensation. I never knew it was like this. Just a quick example. There's Toni Morrison, the American novelist, wrote a novel called Sula, that S-U-L-A, which I particularly like. And just for me, that was her book that most demonstrated to me what it would be like to be a slave. Because there weren't gross indignities, but there was a kind of a milieu of indignity in which slaves lived. They ate humble pie continuously, they ate indignity. And she proves that through her book Sula. And she does it by telling intimate stories, not by giving statistics. And so I think it comes from having read books like that myself and particularly when I was young, and thinking, gee, I'd like to do that.
And the research itself and the discoveries that inevitably come with that, does that thrill you still?
Yes, it does. It does. I'm delighted to be down this wing of the bay because further south there's a place called the Briars that belonged to a fellow called Alexander Balcombe, the father or grandfather of Dame Mabel Brooks, and he was of a family who lived on St Helena, and with whom Alexander Balcombe, who built the Briars down here on the Mornington Peninsula, he belonged to a family, British family, who, when he was a child, had Napoleon in the summer house in their backyard on St Helena. And so the family accumulated, both at that time and later through the wealth of Dame Mabel Brooks, a lot of Napoleana or Napoleonica, and a lot of it was stolen just recently, as you probably know. But I'm fascinated by that family, the Balcombes, and I found out about them by going to an exhibition of Napoleonica or Napoleana at the National Gallery here in Victoria. And there was this name, Balcombe, and a reference to the journal by the girl who was 13 when Napoleon turned up. And Alexander Balcombe was the most successful of the Balcombes here, but he was a little kid on St Helena. Now, Napoleon loved playing with little kids in the good sense, and he loved blind man's buff, and he loved hide and seek. And the little boy was given, Alexander from down here at the Briars, was given on St Helena by the Admiral who was guarding Napoleon a box of bonbons, and his mother said to him, don't eat any of them until you get a chance to offer the Emperor one. In the morning, go down the garden and offer the Emperor one when you see him come out of the pavilion. And little Alexander couldn't help himself eating a few overnight, and he replaced the empty spots in his box of bonbons with all he could find, which was Cenopod anti-constipation medicine, brightly coloured, and he put all these in, the bonbons. He took them to Napoleon. Napoleon ate a Cenopod and said, they have sent a child to kill me. He thought it was poison. Now, that's just an example of what history's really like, of how multi-dimensional it is, and how the personal is, as was said in the 60s, the personal can be political. And I think if you look at Gough Whitlam, and I mention him because he was previously, he's recently died. John Gorton and Gough Whitlam were both flight crew during the war. John Gorton had a number of crashes. Whitlam was a navigator in a Ventura bomber, and he flew many, many missions. But through his war career, you can see that he was stationed in Yirrkala, flying missions against the Japanese, Yirrkala in Northern Australia, and he, through being there, for the first time he sees the condition of the Yolngu people, the famous Yunupingu clan were up there, and he becomes aware that though there is a Fijian padre up there, when a white officer dies, the Fijian padre is not allowed by the squadron leader to bury a white officer. And so he gets a lesson. He is outraged by this. He had an argument with the squadron leader, which would have been, I wish someone had recorded, actually. He had a quarrel with him, but ultimately the squadron leader said, you've got to have a white man to bury a white man. So Gough began to, think of white Australia. And then he gets on leave and he goes to a seminar in Canberra. That's not what my elders did when they got leave during the war. Their convention place was the Horse and Jockey Hotel on Parramatta Road. But the Gough goes off to Canberra to a conference on post-war reconstruction. And he goes back to his squadron, inflamed with the idea that the federal government should have its powers reaffirmed for 5 years after the war. So he went round his squadron. Imagine being an aircraftman of 18 and this tall officer comes along and says, Aircraftsman Gibbs, I want to talk to you about federal powers in post-war reconstruction. And then he's flying missions every day in between persuading the entire squadron to vote yes in the referendum, which failed. But there you can see the concentration on federal powers that some people applauded and some people decried, Aboriginal land rights, and the birth of an impulse towards anti-discrimination legislation. And so, you can see there are wonderful, it's wonderful when you come across these clues to the future and you can deal them. I mean, he ended up flying, what is curious is flying military VIPs from the Philippines back here and to New Guinea. The crew became such an expert crew that they ultimately flew MacArthur and other people around. So there were a crew for VIPs. And can you imagine Gough Whitlam accepting having other VIPs on his plane?
He had some close shaves too. I was surprised to read of his career. I mean, I knew of of Gorton's because he wore the scars, but that was so you're getting a strong flavour here of the way that Tom tells history in all of these volumes. If you haven't dipped into them yet, this is a flavour of how it's done. Let me read you this. This is the third volume, as I say. There's a fourth underway, I think.
Yeah.
Will that be the last?
Yes.
Not that I'm hurrying you, but
and
I know
I don't have to finish it if I die.
They'll let you off the hook. In your introductory note to the second volume, 1860, to the Diggers, you write this: a character in one of my novels says, history is a bugger when you're in it. So what I'm trying to present in these pages, you write, is the narrative of men and women struggling with the histories in which they're stuck. I love that, and it really tells you Tom's approach to history. It's about the people, it's about the situations they find themselves in. And, well, I'm not wanting to sound trite, but now that you've scouted this buggeration of Australian history almost from beginning to end, is there a bit of it that's your favourite?
In this book, there's a man called Jackson, and he is an Australian-born Australian naval officer seconded to the British. And he is an excellent logistician. He is given the job of feeding the Arab population in the Middle East during the war in the Middle East, and during the war against Rommel and the Italians. And he manages to do that so well that he's given the task at the end of the war of dealing with the 8 million people without documents, the displaced persons who are in the camps throughout Europe. And he goes to Chifley, to his home Prime Minister, and says, I'd like you, Mr. Chifley, to take as many as you can, because then I can say Australia's taken these 100,000 displaced persons. He asked for Chifley to take 100,000 first off, and I can use that to get others to accept 100,000, 200,000, dependent on population. So Chifley says to Jackson, I'd consider it, except there are too many Poles and we'll end up like Buffalo, New York, if we have too many polls. But he does take 100, and then he takes another 70 to 80,000 in quick order thereafter. And Basil Jackson ultimately placed those 8 million people throughout the Western world. And that was a great and heroic effort, and I barely heard of the man except as a footnote.
Huh?
And of course, Chifley needed people for the Snowy River scheme and other projects, but still it was good that we took 170,000, and there were no shock jocks to call them names. We just called them names on the street. But that was somehow more benign than having a government sanctioning by using plausibly negative words themselves, encouraging us to take this line. And so that is a fascinating incident in Australian history.
That, as you say, you had only heard as a footnote, and this is the thing, people who I knew only as footnotes come into living colour through your telling in the books. The different thing, of course, about this current volume and the one that's coming up is that you yourself have lived through much of the era that you've written about here. Your own memories, I know, have played a role in it. Young Tom emerges from time to time, for instance, seeing your father off at Sydney Central Railway Station off to the war. But I wonder how this sort of personal stake, how it affected how you approached it and wrote it and how you selected things, and also whether, in thinking about this, whether you found that your own impressions and recollections of events were in some cases wrong.
Some of our familial opinion of Menzies was wrong. And I mean, I was influenced to this extent that I was conscious of women as battlers, women with children, like my mother, whose husbands were away, who didn't have a fridge or a telephone or a car or a washing machine, who were thus reduced to considerable drudgery and during the advance of the Japanese, foresaw, rightly or wrongly for themselves, a destiny rather like that of the women of Nanjing, who had, or Nanking as it was then called, who had suffered acutely at the hands of the Japanese army. And we were aware of Nanking. It was like Guernica. It was like the pre-World War II warning of what could be done to us. And so I got interested in the question of I was a little patriarch too, you know. I was all preparing to be a little Aussie sexist patriarch. You know, we were well trained, and I was fascinated by the fact that I had an aunt down from the bush, and she had a job in an engineering works at Burwood in Sydney, not Burwood down here. I was aware that the question of young women, if you let them leave the bush and work in city factories, you know, anything could happen. And that's why I begin with the flappers. The question of control of women. It was confidently asserted in the 20s because there were girls, working class girls, like the one that Margaret Preston paints, her own maid, Myra, who adopted the flapper ethos and wore the flapper dress and the bobbed hair, and who thought that they believed the propaganda that they received through the movies, that they could initiate sexual affection.
A microphone.
That's fine, thank you. That they could initiate, that they could kiss a boy. They didn't have to wait to be approached. And this ethos very much worried the Australian powers, and how are we going to make them become mothers of a sturdy white race if they wear their skirts above their knees and initiate affection with young men? And the story begins with the book begins with a young woman who adopts the mannerisms of the flapper and who then is raped, and she takes a case and she runs head on into an 1880s version of the law, which virtually says if you kiss a man while you're both on swings in a local park, then you deserve everything you get.
You've asked for it.
The man, says the court, is entitled to his release.
Oh, good grief.
And so that was the question of controlling women. And then the girls that went out with Yanks.
Oh.
And then of course in the 60s, the question of the pill. Would women ever choose to generate children if they had the option of planning their own? And of course, I mean, what is always forgotten is that humans remain humans. Women remain women, men remain men, and having children is something we find hard to get past, to stop doing it, even if we've got a perfect excuse and indeed the technology to prevent it. And
so it is proved.
But control of women is an issue that fascinated me from childhood, because I heard it all around me. Women saying, oh, she goes out with a Yank.
Oh.
And then the question of these young girls who walk. Should a young girl wear shorts? That, I mean, wearing shorts was condemned from the pulpit in the good old days.
Yeah.
And so were various books, of course. in the days when religion was religion, and you could depend on archbishops to ban books and give you a bestseller.
Did any of your early novels ever strike any trouble? Because
the Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith was subject to a campaign by Diane Salento's mother,
yes.
Dame... Ladies, yes.
Yep.
And but apart from that, I was too late for the great age of banning. One of the last gasps of banning books was when they banned customs confiscated copies of The Catcher in the Rye. And then they found that The Catcher in the Rye was in the parliamentary library. And so they were embarrassed into passing it. There was a scandalous novel, a few people in the audience may be old enough to remember, just at the end of World War II, called Love Me Sailor. It's about a femme fatale aboard a steamer. A rough tramp steamer. And it was written by an Australian called Robert Close.
Oh.
And the Victorian authorities moved in on him, and the entire book was read at trial, just to prove how obscene it was, because he was charged with obscene libel, which carried a jail sentence. It's an obscure old crime that's on the books from the days when you could be still in prison for libeling someone. And the obscene libel was the implication that you're implying that such things as happened on the SS, whatever its name was, were likely to happen in Victorian society, when of course they weren't. And so he did a little time in jail in Pentridge, and then he left for Majorca and lived in Spain and in Paris for a while, where Miller, the Tropic of Cancer man?
Yes.
Henry Miller said that it was the Love Me Sailor was a groundbreaking book, that it was one of the great erotic novels of all time. It hasn't quite lived up to that premise, but we're great banners of books because we're worried about their impact on the young and upon young women. And we had to populate or perish, and therefore you didn't go off gallivanting on a steamer with a pack of sailors. You married Eric.
Well, it's I'm interested to hear about your early awareness of women through the Second World War period, because I somehow thought that, women, I think, get a pretty fair hearing in your books, in your histories. They emerge as figures with an equal share in the world, or who should have an equal share. And I put it down to your having two daughters.
Yes, that was a big impact. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago about two nurses, two sisters, and I've got two sisters, though these sisters are very different from my daughters. I don't know where they came from. Writing is very mysterious. If you sit down and start writing, things, as well as thinking of things seem to be provided from nowhere by your subconscious, And even the images you apply, even what you select here and what you say about what it means, even in nonfiction. As you know, you're a splendid writer of nonfiction, and in fact, John Fane today mentioned your name, so as a splendid writer of nonfiction, and so it's a creative process too.
Yes, it's mysterious, isn't it? As you say, when you're dealing with nonfiction, that it still takes that shape in a way that defies your own understanding.
Yes, there is a natural taste for defining the characters and what they say in letters and elsewhere might mean.
Yeah. You just touched on what you leave in and what you leave out. Am I right that the Cowra breakout didn't get a mention in this book, and yet at the same time you must have been working on your novel on that subject?
Yes.
How did that happen that it didn't rate a mention in here?
I wanted to put it in, but I think that the question of the Japanese military culture of the time was adequately addressed by looking at what happened to the poor young men who were in the so-called Malayan Wall. It was a battalion in Rabaul, it was a battalion in Ambon, and a battalion in Timor. And they were cleaned up in various ways, and then many were massacred, particularly in Ambon, but also in Rabaul. Terrible, unspeakable massacres, although I've got a theory of some of the things that led to those massacres that I deal with in the book, but they were inexcusable. I've lost the question again. I'm so sorry.
We were talking about leaving out the Cowra breakout.
Invites a 79-year-old. This is the sort of thing. Leaving out Cowra, and I thought Cowra, you're quite right, Cowra had already, that militarist ethos had already been illustrated by what I'd already written. Cowra was interesting. It happened when I was 9, and in a town west of Sydney, about 4 or 5 hours drive these days, and there were some thousands of Italians there, of all political stripes, and there were 1,000 young Japanese prisoners. We treated them quite well, both because we'd signed the Geneva Convention, but also quite well in material terms, I mean, but also because we were scared that if we in any way created an impression that we were being cruel to them, something evil would happen to the 25 or so thousand, including civilians and soldiers, that they were holding of ours. These young men one night in 1944, first weekend of 1944, charged the wire There were certain events that provoked this, but they were seeking their own death. And I was fascinated when I found that. When we thought they were after us when they broke out, but in fact most of them were killed in the process of breaking out. But in fact they were looking for self-exoneration. They were looking to expiate having been captured. And it just seemed to me how remarkable cultural differences can be, that you can, in a particular culture, through influencing the young, you can convince them that their continued existence is a matter of shame and they should obliterate themselves. And I had the same thing through studying with the priesthood. We were taught that celibacy was a normal thing, and even I worked out. And so you can condition, and I wanted to write about it from that point of view, and I thought the novel would adequately cover that, and I thought that the question of our relationship with the Japanese had been already, and that militarist punishing culture, punishing to the people who practice it, punishing to their victims, had already been canvassed. And so I moved on to the young women that the Aussie soldiers took up with in Japan. There are in Australia men who would be not quite my age, but they'd be half Australian, half Japanese kids now, illegitimate kids, and they were never allowed anywhere near Australia because of the White Australia policy. But what about when young men fell for the Japanese girls in Kore, where they were stationed, and they were told they weren't to fraternise and were punished and fined, and even locked up for it, and so with the women. So then some of them secretly married in Shinto ceremonies, and then ultimately the authorities had to cast their hands up and let them marry. And the Japanese wives who came in the 1950s, if I had a backer, the first movie I'd make would be about a Japanese wife, 9,000, 10,000 miles, I don't know, not as much as that, 8,000 miles from the nearest Japanese grocery store, living in St. Helens, Tasmania, with her husband, with the local RSL, and the question of his parents, who even, one woman in the book tells the story of looking forward to her parents-in-law going away. She lives in the spare bedroom with her husband, and she finds the ingredients for rice cakes by scouring Perth, and she's going to make rice cakes for herself and her baby while the in-laws are away. And they drive off, and she gets all the ingredients, cooks them, and she's just about to tuck in when the parents arrive home again because the trip's been cancelled for some reason. And she hides these rice cakes under the bed. And what a story is that? What a poignant story. And so the Japanese were many things. They were, as well as being our enemies in World War II, they were seductresses too, who were picking on our nice boys. But they're also the first dent in white Australia.
Interesting point, yes, and that's, fits beautifully within this volume and also the earlier one where you take us through Federation and the marvellous Alfred Deakin, of whom we've already spoken off stage. We're getting close to our time, not quite, but you've got more ideas obviously than you have time to write about, and I'm not talking about the clock ticking, I'm talking about just that you have more ideas than you can actually write down. You'd like to make a film of that one. What do you do with them all? Do they keep coming, and what do you do with the ones that you don't get to write about?
Yeah, well, I'm always telling people in volume 2 there are the Dickens. The great thing about Australia's story is that, and the story of Australians, is that we remained a dumping ground after convictism because really we're either economic refugees or if we came from the gentry, we're often the dumber end of the gentry. And for example, Charles Dickens sent his two dumb sons to Victoria. And their names were Alfred Tennyson Dickens and Edward, who's the other Victorian novelist, but Edward Dickens anyhow, Plawn, and was his nickname. And Anthony Trollope sent to New South Wales his son Fred on the same grounds. He's not good at the classics. He's not good at algebra. He'll do fine in Australia. He likes. Dickens writes to Plawn's teacher and says, "Don't teach him any more Latin. It's a waste of time." And he won't need it, given the rough, hearty life he will live in the Australian colonies. It was not only a rough, hardy life, but it sent him broke as well. It was a tragic life. And so we get all these people. It's wonderful to be the country. I get a perverse thrill out of being founded as a penal settlement, as a settler community. We're founded as a purpose-designed penal settlement, which meant that we weren't Adam and Eve. We didn't land as the Americans did in Massachusetts, already redeemed, too good for England. We were too bad for England. And we were too bad for other parts of the United Kingdom too. And then we continue being right up to the time of my friend David Hill, who was similarly dumped here. We became a dumping ground, often a tragic dumping ground, because Dickens didn't understand the iso-heights, that, you got to have, Magwitch in Great Expectations was a convict and made a fortune, but by the time his sons got here, the land that was left was out on the Will Canyon. Now this is, if any of you are playwrights, for God's sake, write this play. It is that there was a time in the 1870s when two Dickens and a Trollope were members of the...
A Trollope with an E on the end.
Yeah, with an E on the end, yeah. The old joke, the bishop loved to curl up on the couch with his favourite, with the latest Trollope. It was a book. Although one never knows with bishops. And so there are three of them playing cricket, and they're waiting to go into bat against Burke on a sweltering afternoon. And their discourse, a wicket falls, one of them goes in, the discourse immediately changes, but they're talking about their relationship to their famous fathers and what they're being here in the netherworld, in the underworld. Orpheus looking for his... who was his girlfriend again? I have lost my...
Eurydice,
yeah. I've lost my Eurydice, yeah. And so they're...
that's a play waiting to be written.
Wandering up occasionally saying, "You're really Chicken Dickens' son?" And so that's a play. I don't know where it goes, but it's all about this thing that Oscar Wilde said in The Importance of Being Earnest. Jack says, your uncle said at dinner last night that you must choose between this world, the next world, and Australia. And it gives me perverse joy to know that even our betters, as a working class child of working class immigrants, to know that even our betters aren't the crop of the cream of the crop. And yet we've managed to learn how to use knives and forks and
Here's a man with so many ideas he can afford to give them away. So somebody please take that up and give Tom the pleasure of seeing that realised. You're 79 at your own admission, and you can still pull an audience. And just within this past week in Brisbane, Gold Coast, Byron Bay, and possibly other points north, for all I know. Are the things that because of your age you feel you can't say, or that because of your age you feel that you can say, or even compelled to say that once you might not?
Yes, you get more reckless with what you say when you get older.
Good.
And you're more likely to admit your crimes, your early love affairs, all.
Well, come on, we've still got 3 minutes left, so.
But I'm not gonna touch the cross-dressing thing. That's a foul line. And I buy the clothes for my wife. But yes, you get more reckless, and you feel the stakes are high because of grandchildren. It's peculiar, but and you start taking on the duty of forming an alliance involving profane jokes and profane ditties, schoolboy type jokes and ditties, and with your grandchildren.
Uh-huh.
And I've written a series of rap nursery rhymes, and the grandkids love them, and my daughters hate them, abominate them.
You perform these for them?
Yeah, and they love it. There's just one. This dude called Humpty has to sit on a wall, and what does he do? But he's got to fall. The Marines come in and do quite well, but you can't put an ovoid back in its shell. Along come the cops and the FBI. They say, you ain't worth nothing except a fry.
I think this is the perfect moment to hand over to you. Who has a question that's burning in them? There's a microphone coming your way. Hold tight. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the cream of the crop and Menzies. Do you know anything about when he was in Britain during the war, and he fancied taking over from Churchill and becoming leader of the whole world and a bit more? Yeah, any views on him at all?
He was very interested in becoming a member of the cabinet, the war cabinet, and he hoped that would happen. So he spent a tremendous amount of time in England. I mean, prime ministers could do that stuff then. And even in the 50s, he was able to go to cricket tests and so on, whole cricket test series in the UK. Yes, sadly, the more he stayed away, the more his popularity dipped in Australia. And so by the time they were ready to take him into the war cabinet, he had failed in Australia and been replaced by Artie Fadden. And like John Howard, he remade himself. John Howard was able to remake himself after losing the leadership of the opposition. He came back, and Menzies came back because Menzies appealed, as his own speech said, to the forgotten people. In the suburbs, Australians felt that okay, the trade unions were looking after the workers, the Country Party was looking after the bush, who was looking after the mortgage payers of the respectable suburbs, and that was his success. But I think, look, we were taught, my mother and father virtually told me that Menzies let us totally down. He was always in England. He was not preparing for the coming of the Japanese. He let our troops be in the wrong place. He was succoured by Singapore and so on. And all that is true. But when you get to it, there are strong reasons why he was and why he had to be. There are even strong reasons why he said Great Britain has declared war on Germany, and as a result, we are at war with... Yeah. And I've got a chapter in there called As a Result that looked at the various reactions to that. Ipso facto, they're at war, we're at war. And again, I don't, he's a very interesting and complex man. He's affection for the empire, I think, betrayed him into being that emissary to Colonel Nasser during the 50s. And of course, his sincere fear of communism and his desire to have nuclear technology led to those catastrophic nuclear tests. And I've got to say that our troops for those tests, compared to the Americans and the British, were very ill-equipped, and he'd have to bear some of the blame of that. British bombers that flew through the nuclear clouds had protective clothing, sealed planes, and dosimeters to show how radioactive things were. Our blokes just had their uniforms, and they would fly through an entire atomic cloud and follow it towards Charters Towers and then swing back and land in New South Wales with their engines clogged with radioactive dust. And blokes in overalls, Air Forcemen in overalls, would have to clean that out. So we were fairly cavalier in the way we took on those atomic tests, but there were reasons why they seemed to make sense at the time.
Certainly Menzies is a big figure in this, necessarily in
and
this,
the atomic tests are fascinating.
They are.
They'd make a great novel.
We have another question over here.
Tom, what was it like working with Steven Spielberg on Schindler's Ark?
Oh, well, look, it was... you're getting on to my 3.23 seconds of fame. He was a terrific bloke. He's got a strong mother who's about 47, and she's called Mrs. Adler. He's the sort of bloke you can see a strong mother behind who says, say thank you to the nice lady, you know. And so he's very constructive, very sure, and very consultative. So when he decided, my friend Poldek called me and said, Stephen has had the flu and he has decided it's time he makes the movie. He's going to make... Poldek was a survivor. And I said, Poldek, he'll change his mind when his temperature goes down. But he didn't. And he asked everyone in. He asks, except he was a bit scared of Poldek because Poldek used to say to him, Stephen, make our movie. You can't win the Academy Award with little furry animals, enough with the little furry animals. And so he was great to work with as long as you were positive, and he invited us onto the set as long as we wanted to be, and he invited us to as many premieres as we wanted to go to, and so on. He's a pretty good bloke. And he sent a message for my 50th year. He did a video recording for my 50th year this year, which was good of him. I think Schindler, the fact that Schindler, which I have nothing to do with in terms of the kind of film it is, that's his job. I think the fact it was accepted with critical acclaim liberated him to make a lot of other quite good films, like Munich. I think Munich's a very good film.
So it made a more serious filmmaker of him, you think?
Yes, because his other serious films, Empire of the Sun and The Colour Purple, had not been treated well by the critics. I think Empire of the Sun is extraordinary. But
yeah, I've seen that one. Another question. Let's see a hand. Oh, we've got one here, right here.
Sorry, just wondering if there's a topic you've always wanted to write about, but you've never found the right time, occasion, research people to talk to about it.
Yes, there are many such topics. There was an Italian POW called Eduardo Simoni, captured at Bardia, and he escaped. Most of the Italians, once captured, just got on with making their grappa and playing the mandolin and singing an occasional fascist hymn when they were ordered to by their officers. But Eduardo Simoni was a genuine fascist and a graduate of the military academy in Modena, and he escaped 3 times, and the last escape is fantastic. He escaped from Hay. He left money behind for the guards to have a drink. He had a huge and dangerous escape. He walked away from a guard on the instinct that he wouldn't be shot. There was a bloke with a gun saying, "Stop, you dago bastard," etc., etc. And he thought, this bloke isn't going to stop me. And he was in a rowboat. He just kept on rowing down the Murrumbidgee at that stage. It was quite close to Hay. And the bloke typically called after him and said, "All right, but you wild bastard, but there's mounted troops and police all over the lower river, or the upper river. No, the lower river, and so you're going to be caught anyhow. So I'm not going to bloody shoot you. Have your own way." And he had to hide amongst the Calabrians and the Sicilians in the irrigation area. And he took on the identity of a Calabrian. Now, to him, he was an aristocratic northern Italian. To him, taking on a Calabrian identity was like becoming a non-person. But he lived under that identity. He wore a dead man's suit. He had a dead man's pass, enemy alien pass. He came to Melbourne and got a job as a door-to-door salesman of Watkins products. The Watkins man used to come round with a suitcase. And so he finds himself, a bloke who looks like Marcello Mastroianni, wandering round Melbourne and knocking on the doors of lonely women. He had a tremendous time. And he also had a housekeeper. He stayed in a boarding house that belonged to a red-headed left-wing Labor woman who had him out stealing ballots in a union election. And the groupers, the forerunners of the groupers, phalangist type of trade unions, started beating him up for helping his girlfriend steal a ballot box. And he's trying to say, "Look, I'm a fascist too." And then he was recaptured in Fitzroy Gardens. And then he became a Euro-communist, having been a fascist.
Good grief.
So that's a story I tried to write, and I'd love to, but haven't been able to. I just couldn't think of myself, I couldn't think myself into that aristocratic, I couldn't recreate his world adequately. I thought, you're going to have to live for a year in Modena and get that North Italian sniffy thing that they have. It lapsed.
So that's the novel that got away.
Oh, there are many of them.
There are many of them? I think we've got another question over here.
In your lifetime, have you had an interest in a particular sport? And if so, does it appear in any of your writings, your interest?
Well, my sports when I was a little kid were the vulgar and despicable rugby league, the game of hoons and drongos. And I still get a kick out of it. My father was quite a good player, and I had just enough success to be totally hooked. And the other one was track and field. Mm-hmm. And I thought I desperately wanted to be a bit of a jock, because I thought girls were impressed, but they're not. And so there was a day we were playing, I was a halfback, and I had outside me 2 blokes who ran in the Olympics, ultimately. One in the 1956 Olympics down here. And there was a beautiful girl from Ashfield in the stand, and I really wanted to impress her. and her brother was playing second row and was supposed to tackle me, but he was a thinker, he wasn't a warrior, and so I was able to step in and score under. I didn't give it to the athletes outside me. I scored under the post. I looked up and she had her back turned. My 1 hour of glory.
Those fickle girls of Ashfield, we've heard of them. Their reputation comes before them. Do we have time for one more? I think we do, and there's a microphone.
Tom, you mentioned about training for the priesthood. I've just wondered whether your film acting career began and finished with The Devil's Playground.
The Devil's Playground, that was made out here in Werribee, actually, and by Fred Schepisi, and it was a great success for Australian film, and he made it on $350,000. He raised $5,000 a time by going to art shows and selling $5,000 units to lawyers and brain surgeons and so on. And anyhow, I took the part of a priest in it. He couldn't afford actors.
You also had a part in Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith.
And the Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith, and there's one other film, and the latest one, I was a doorkeeper in a movie called The Final Winter that opened the Sydney Festival. It's a film that was made by a footballer, a rugby league footballer, who wrote a brilliant book published by Penguin about what it is to be a tough guy and doubt your masculinity, and what it is to have a father who's the conditioner for the Australian Army and for the Kangaroos and for the Australian cricket team and for Manly Warringah rugby league team, to have that sort of father. So when you're not playing rugby league, you're beating someone else up in the ring. And he writes about the brittle masculinity, and he raised $1.5 million and made his own movie about... It's a very fine movie. It's in the tradition of this sporting life, but even though it's a universal subject, you guys won't watch it because it's about rugby league. But it did open the Sydney Festival, and I acted in that as a gatekeeper. I had to say to him, we laboured on the text, I had to say to him something grand like, he's rubbed out of the game because he's too rough for the new corporate image. And the corporation says, get rid of this thug. And I say to him, oh, grub, mate, are we ever going to bloody miss you round here?
Tell us the name of this film again.
The Final Winter.
Remember that? Seek it out.
It's a very fine movie. He writes women superbly. He writes the player's wife and daughters, and the way they're secretly humanised, this man, to an extent. It's a very fine film. His name is Matthew Nable, N-A-B-L-E, and he played in it, and he's played in some American stuff now. He's writing American film scripts, and he played in Underbelly. He was a cop in one of the series of Underbelly, had two main protagonists, and he was the cop. I forget what that one was about.
Well, it sounds like the film would be worth seeing just to hear or see you deliver the line, grub, that grub, mate. So that image will live with me from tonight,
and
as well as
one of those white coats.
A white coat.
That your touch judge, or your extra man, or your, what did you call that? Goal. Yeah.
Okay, a white coat.
As we used to say in mockery of AFL, which is a grand game, I have to admit. But in New South Wales, we used to say when a behind was scored, how long is it, umpire? And the bloke came like this.
That's beautiful.
The party's getting rough.
Tom, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you all. Any further questions you might like to address personally to Tom when you meet him at the signing table? Your own very successful Robinson's Bookshop is selling mountains of copies of Tom's latest books up the back there, and he'll be happy to sign for you. So do take your place in the queue and have the chance to ask that question yourself. And thank you so much, especially for the...
Thank you very much.